will present position and support for resource extraction. His most recent book is also about resource extraction and support and project in Peru. So I'll just let him speak and then we can ask some questions.
Thank you, Jimena. So thank you for the invitation to be here today. Thank you, Gustavo. I know it's a busy week for you guys because of finals. My students in Missouri are taking their final right now, so it's good to be here. So we get to hear the complaints. Anyway, so part of what I've done, or part of what you have seen in some of this literature is people trying to understand sort of the emergence of protest movements against mining or against resource extraction, right? And typically the research talks about the grievances that motivate people to protest, or people will talk about, the different types of coalitions that protesters have formed in opposition to mining, as well as sort of like the political conditions that facilitate the emergence of these movements. And in this sort of like new phase of my research, I was interested in looking more at the individual level attitudes about of individuals who may be willing to support mining or are generally opposed to resource extraction. So in this case, what you will see is a survey analysis using a new survey of a new mining project called Tia Maria in southern Peru, where in fact you have opposition and support for mining. Right? In the book that Jimena was mentioning, I talk about two big sort of like broad categories of mobilizations against mining, right? And so some of them I call them rights-oriented or rights-based mobilizations. And generally here people are fighting for water, for the environment. In some cases it would be cultural survival or cultural identity. We're thinking about indigenous groups. It's something about rights that people are, in this case, fighting for. And generally these are, if you want to call it, your typical anti-extraction, anti-mining mobilization, right? This would be considered sort of like all or nothing type of mobilization. Either there is mining or there is agriculture. You can't have both, right? And on the other hand, you have cases where you have mobilizations, but in this case, they're engaging in what I call some type of distributional struggle, right? They're trying to be the affected communities, maybe trying to get some revenues, or having the company perhaps give more revenues to the communities, or some type of reclamation project. So in this case, the protests or the mobilizations are simply used as a tool, as a bargaining tool to get the mining company in the sort of negotiating table. And once a concession is made, then the mobilization disappears until there is the opportunity for a new mobilization and a new opportunity to sit on the table and negotiate new terms. Right? The point about this is that in the universe of sort of like mobilizations against mining, right, only a very small fraction, right, it's actually only a small fraction we're thinking about mobilizations that are successfully have stopped mining, right? So there was a recent report for the environmental justice atlas somewhere in Europe that talk about how estimated the number of mining conflicts around the world, and roughly less than a third were successful in stopping mining, right? So in more than 2/3 of cases, mining actually wins, right? And partly because there's huge power imbalances between a mining corporation and communities, and you also have to take into account that national governments side with mining companies, and if you want to call it to the detriment of these communities, right? So there's a little bit of, if you want to call it, a bias in the literature, in the sense that most scholars or students out there are looking for these successful cases, right? or all of this, all or nothing, right? But in reality, there's only a few of those. So part of what I wanted to do here is look at a more typical case where you have both opposition and support, right? So the Tia Maria case that I mentioned, folks have done survey questions, and sometime in April 2005, for instance, people were asked, are you willing to support the project, right? And 60% said yes, right? And 29% said no, right? But then there were mobilizations, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. And 3 people were killed in a clash with the police, and they went ahead and asked the same question, are you willing to support this project? In this case, the yeses were 46% and the noes were 43%, right? So kind of like evenly split. In my own survey that I did, also in 2015, but in November, kind of ending the year, only 40% said yes to the project and 53 said no, right? So we went from a high yes in the early 2015 to a low yes at the end of the same year. So this framework of rights and service actually came up during a field trip. So I was conducting interviews, and I was talking to a colleague who is involved with lots of NGOs, and I was trying to make sense of what these mobilizations are about. And his response was basically, is it about rights or is it about services? Right? Which is nice because it kind of fits, if you want to call it, my understanding of what politics is about. Is either you wanting something or you preventing others from wanting something. Right? So it's reclaiming the land, the water that is yours, in the case of farmers, so to speak, or is wanting the mining company to give you something, right? And so the language about threat and opportunity, very familiar in the social movements literature. The scholars will write about this, so they will talk about those right-based mobilizations as struggles for procedural justice, whereas the fights about services, they will be called distributional struggles about something else. Right? So there's a lot of familiar language here. And the final point about this is that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in this category of service, right, which is this, right? So again, there is not really an organization behind those protests. So again, they're activated. They bring the mining companies to the negotiating table, and then those organizations evaporate or disappear. But in the other case of the rights-oriented mobilizations, you do have what you can characterize as a sustained organized resistance. Right? And in other words, the case that I wanted to mention today, Tia Maria, goes back to 2008, 2009, and we're still talking about Tia Maria in 2015. Right? Some of them with this same actor. So it comes close to having, if you want to call it, an organized resistance. And in my book, what I argue is that only in those cases you're likely to see, if you want to call it, changes in policy or substantive gains on behalf of protesters. But only when you have what you can characterize as a sustained resistance. The Tia Maria case, and here I'm looking at this table. Again, it's located in southern Peru, but I'll show you in a map in a few minutes where you can actually see the agricultural area, which happens to be very close to where the new mining development can take place. Right? So it will be an example of high competition with agriculture similar to Tambo Grande, talking about right here. Right? And the other thing that we have seen in these cases, whereas there's high competition with agriculture, what I argue is that in those cases, the agricultural economy, by its very definition, provides a number of pre-existing organizations. Right? In this case, we're talking about water boards or producers or organizations. And typically, those pre-existing organizations will coalesce, right, into some type of, or will be recast in some other type of organization, like a defense front on behalf of this particular valley or agricultural area. They will create alliances with regional organizations. Right? So my point here is that in cases where you have high competition with agriculture, you already have, if you want to call it, a number of pre-existing organizations, and those are critical if you want to call it for a sustained resistance or sustained challenge against resource extraction. Right? The opposite would be to talk about an area where you have low competition. Right? And I was talking about this earlier. Right? If you think about Chile, in northern Chile, it's a desert. Right? There's no competition with agriculture. Right? And in those areas, most likely extraction weakens. Right? There may be protests, it will be workers against the mine, but you're not going to see, if you want to call it a broad sector of actors, students, farmers, fighting resource extraction. Right? So those would be, if you want to call it, the two extreme cases. In the Q&A, I can talk about the other two contexts, the other two boxes in this table. Right? So again, Tia Maria, it is an example of a rights-based mobilization. You have high competition with agriculture, right? In a way, it's a new green field, but we're talking about Southern Copper Corporation, a company that was established in Peru back in the late 1950s. So it's not a new mining company, it's not the arrival of a new mining company, it's a company that has been in the area going back to the late 1950s. Now they just happen to reach out to a new area that happens to be close to a valley, in this case the Tambo Valley. Right? And what you will expect, right, is that the districts that are very close to where the mining will be are highly opposed to the project, but the districts that are distant from what you can call the direct impacts of the project, they're actually okay with the project going forward, right? So in the map, just very briefly, so this is Coca Chacra right here, this is Mejia, and this is the Amba Libya, right? And there's the river, and that will be the agricultural valley. Right? So this is southern Peru, Arequipa is right there. When I was talking about earlier, first of all, this is my first survey, so I have done a lot of research on mining, but using also different type of data, interviews, and state data aggregated at the level of the state. But when I went to launch the survey, right, I actually learned a lot of things, right? First of all, sometimes the mining company will say that if the project goes forward, it's going to bring better jobs to the region, right? And just by being there, you can actually you probably say, I cannot agree with the mine, right? Because the agricultural economy there is not very well developed. So we can give the mining company, if you want to call it, a pass on that one, or in parentheses for now. Right? But on the other hand, the local population will tell you that we don't buy this argument that if the project goes forward, we're going to see jobs, right? And the point here is that when you look at if you want to call it the socio-demographic makeup of that region, right, it's mostly farmers, right? And you will come to the conclusion that says there is no way in the next 50 years that the mine is ever going to give you a job, right? Mostly because the local population there will not be qualified to work in the mine. Right? So both of them, if you want to call it, you can see both sides of the argument, right? So the mining company says this may be better for the region, at least in the short term, right? Farmers would simply not buy it. Right? What I also remember here is that in the Tambo Valley, the movements that were against mining, they will talk about how this region happens to be the breadbasket of the region of Arequipa. Right? Not true. Right? There's other regions in Arequipa that are fairly more productive than this specific region. Right? So Islay is, oops, did I skip that? Let me go back to this. So Islay is right here, right? The population, again, is roughly 53,000, so it's not a heavily populated area. But Arequipa, which is maybe the second, third largest city in Peru, is very close to Islay. So the distance is maybe 1 hour and a half, something like that, right? But in the surveys, again, the support for Tia Maria a lot stronger in Arequipa, but the opposition to Tia Maria is a lot stronger on those specific districts. Right? All right, so let me just highlight, going back to this, a few of the events, right? A little bit trying to trace the history. There's a lot of, interesting details here, so I'm just going to highlight a few of them. This goes back, originally, Southern Copper Corporation was Southern Peruvian Copper Corporation. Sometime in 2005, 2006, they merged with Mexican copper industry. They became Southern Copper Corporation. So I guess it was part of that merger with a Mexican company that they decided to expand the mine to this new area of Tia Maria. So in 2009, they presented what is called, the first environmental report, Estudio Impacto Ambiental. There were a lot of problems with this environmental report, mainly because of the source of water. The company was arguing that they would use subsoil water for the project, right? And this was highly controversial. It's very close to that river, very close to that agricultural area. In the same year, fast forward to September 2009, there was a popular referendum in the district of Coca Chacra. The referendum had observers, right? So first of all, these referendums are not legally sanctioned, right? So there's nothing in the Constitution or in the books that says that districts can organize a referendum against mining. They just did it on their own, right? And then they called some observers, and the vote takes place on a Sunday, and there were a couple of questions, overwhelming opposition to the referendum. But again, the referendum is not binding, so there's no, so the project continues. Again, you have this defense front in defense of Coca Chacra, made up of pre-existing agricultural organizations, so the leaders of those organizations will be leaders of the front, right? And the first early wave of strikes is taking place between 2010 and 2011, and that's when at least three protesters died, right, in a clash with the police, right? And I wrote this about my book, and I was like, it was it's kind of like a successful case, huge mobilization. It's sad the loss of human life, a referendum. I said the case of Tia Maria is close. If you ever had a chance to look at the conclusion of the book, that's what it says. Tia Maria is a win case, and you can all go home. It didn't. So what happened is people made question the environmental impact report. The company went forward. Okay, now we need to fix this environmental impact report. And in this case, the company came back saying, we're going to continue with the project, but we're no longer going to rely on subsoil water. We're going to use the water from the ocean, right, to use the water that we need, right, for this project. And the government says, now that the company has fixed the problems with the environmental impact report, we are okay with this. The ministers of government says the company has done everything by the books. Obviously, the project can go forward, but that didn't stop protesters for continuing with their fight against the company, right? So in 2014, December 2014 and 2015, again, strikes, mobilization. Some of them organized by the local mayors, some of them involving other organizations. And then in the second wave, at least one protester died in a clash with the police. Right? So right now, this is where the project is. Right? It's a little bit of a stalemate. Right? So the survey that I've done includes the population of Islay, which is near the project, and as well as populations in in Arequipa, which is a large city. And so part of here is that I wanted to have a sample that will capture both the support and opposition to the mining, right? The survey was, I had the assistance of the local university, Universidad Nacional San Agustín. The students went there and collected the data. And when we were in the slide, people were asking, are you doing this survey for the mining company? And I said, no. Are you guys doing the survey for an NGO opposed to mining? No. Are you guys doing the survey for the national government? No. We're just doing a survey. And they just, there's big polling firms in Peru like Ipsos Apoyo, and at some point I approached Ipsos and they were saying, no, we can't go there. We're not welcome, right? So it was nice to rely on the local students of the university. They have their IDs, and because they see that they're from the same place, they were okay, filling out the forms. Right? But a couple of polling firms in Peru, they were like, that's a no. We can't go to that region. It would be very hostile.
Excuse me, what's on the ground at the time you're talking about? How far had the mining? What's on the ground?
Nothing.
Nothing. Absolutely
Nothing.
nothing. Okay.
This is the environmental impact report is basically like a blueprint. This is where we're going to. This is the area where we will build the plant, and this is the likely impact that it may have on the environment. There's nothing on the ground.
Nothing started yet.
Nothing.
Thank you.
But
Sorry.
but you kind of see that this goes back to 2009, right? So it's a sustained resistance, and nothing has happened now, up until now. Right? So to this day, there's nothing. It's a good question. So now I'm just going to move forward just to look at the survey, and obviously I don't have a lot of time to talk about a little bit the complexity of these indicators. So the variable that I'm interested in, at least on this first, is looking at, just support for the project, right? So it's a dichotomous variable. In one for yes, 0 for no, right? And I kind of like chose that, because I wanted to talk back to the previous surveys, right? I wanted to see how my results compared to previous surveys. And kind of like the four variables that I'm mostly interested here is thinking about people's attitudes about the environment or agriculture, so this will be capturing those rights-based claims, and at the same time thinking about those service-based claims, but thinking about more about the distribution of mineral revenues. Right? So in Peru, they're called the canon minero, right? There's a lot of mining in Arequipa, so Arequipa is not new to mining, so the region of Arequipa receives revenues from mining. So the idea of going forward with the Tia Maria project is simply meant more mining revenues to the region, right? But as I talk about in a few minutes, it's regions only get a share of those revenues, they don't get all of it, right? And at the same time, the government has all sorts of restrictions in terms of how do they get to spend those revenues. I also, introduce all sorts of, standard controls, like people's perception of the national economy or their personal economy. There were questions that we're asking them about, the trust in institutions or whether they participate in community organizations, as well as approval of the regional government. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see the results, but I'll just quickly show you what's happening here. So in the first model, we're talking about this, right? So I'm excluding all these four variables that have to do with service rights claims and rights-based claims. Right? So here, quickly, what you see is that the higher the level of the approval of the governor, more likely to support the Tia Maria project. And the higher the income level of an individual, more likely to support the Tia Maria project. The other one has to do with the perceptions of the national economy. So if you think that the economy today is better compared to 12 months ago, you're more likely to support the economy. Right? So here, I simply introduce the variables that have to do with environment and agriculture. So the negative sign will say that someone who thinks that mining hurts agriculture is less likely to support mining. And model 3 is about the perception of the distribution of mineral revenue. So if you think that the distribution of revenues is just or fair, you are more likely to support mining. If you think that the execution of the distribution of mining revenues is good or very good, you're more likely to support mining. And simply, lastly, the last 4 models includes all those variables together, and the coefficients and the signs of the coefficients stay the same. Right? So those who have concerns about the environment or agriculture, this is the same information, are less likely to support mining. We're talking about here and here. Those who think about sort of the economic impact of mining are more likely to support it. And approval for the government stays, national economy stays, as well as income. So, like I was talking about a few minutes ago, if you were to ask, so where is the project today? Is it going to go forward? Is it dead? Like I said in my book, I thought it was settled, and obviously it wasn't, right? It is not settled, right? And if you pick up some of the, literature, not just in Peru but elsewhere, right? Governments are still interested in promoting resource extraction, right? So, and in the Peruvian case, people will tell you that, mining is the future of Peru. Peru is a mining country, among other things. So there's a lot of discussions about, how do we, overcome this stalemate? Right? How do we, what settles this? And there's all sorts of proposals, right? So people will tell you, there has to be more negotiation, right? Or the government at some point says, well, maybe we need to give individuals consultation rights, right? So in Peru, they implemented this law called the law of prior consultation, right? But as it turns out, consultation rights are only for oil and gas, it's not for mining. And then on top of that, those consultation rights are only for individuals that are considered indigenous by the government, right? And by the indigenous, they're thinking about people who live in the Amazon region, right? So there's no consultation rights in this case, right? A minister of the environment of Humala said that maybe the way to resolve this problem is if to have the leaders of communities sit on the governing boards of these mining companies. Or an extension of that, maybe there has to be some kind of profit sharing with the communities, right? There's all sorts of proposals. And obviously business people say that's just nuts. We're not going to allow community leaders to say, this is complex business decisions. And then you can paraphrase what was said exactly, but it's something very similar to that. So yesterday I learned that Jimena was born in Arequipa. I was born in Arequipa, right? So so I came up with my own solution, right? I'm just joking. So in my survey, I asked individuals whether they would be willing to support the project if the region takes ownership of the project, right? Because right now, like I said, the region only gets 50% of the project or something like that. But on top of that, the government regulates all sorts of things about how revenues are spent, right? So this question was simply, same question: are you willing to support the project if the region takes ownership of this project, right? So same models, and what you see here is that first of all, the standard predictors of income, approval of the government, and the national economy that stay. But the impact of those environmental factors disappears, right? And the variables that are capturing the impact of mining, they stay positive and they stay significant. So this is the same information. So distribution and execution are highly significant, positive. National perception of the national economy, the approval of the government, and this goes in there. So again, in this discussion about how to go forward, right? And you may find papers, that talk about this. You're going to have to find the shape of a triangle, right? You have the national government, you have the mining companies, and you have communities, right? And people will say, actually, the national government is a lot closer to the mining. There's a little bit of skepticism about the national government because on the one hand, they extend the rights to mining, and at the same time, they're in charge of protecting the environment, right? And then how can you can't be a fair judge, so to speak, if you give rights for mining, at the same time you have to control, right? But part of what they're trying to do is they capture the distance, right? That a lot of this, particularly where the impact of the mining is, that there are maybe voiceless, right? In the sense that it's not mining doesn't have the best interest of the community when they're thinking about extending those rights, and neither is the national government, right? So in the surveys, people would ask, so people would ask, so tell me what one thing that the government can do, to resolve this conflict, right? And one thing that people single out, not just in my survey, is they talk about, like in other surveys, is fulfill agreements. Right? The mining company needs to fulfill whatever agreements they sign. Right? But this goes back to, then it's a local issue, right? I mean, I don't think the national government is interested in making sure that those companies fulfill those agreements, right? It has to be more a little bit of a stakeholder approach in the local politics, right? And I think this is part of what it's capturing, right? That maybe if there's such thing as ownership, then there may be better accountability, monitoring, if the project goes forward. Right? So just to conclude, I guess it's nice for me, you hear a lot about, protesters are fighting about the environment, or thinking about water, or thinking about agriculture. So it's nice that, however imperfect the survey is, it does capture that individuals concerned about the environment or the attitude are predictors, right? While controlling for all sorts of variables, right? For my own, if you want to call it peace of mind as a researcher, right? I ask a question, will you be willing to participate in a protest against resource extraction, right? And the results flipped, right? So the folks who care about the environment and water, highly likely to participate in a protest against extraction. And the folks who think that mining is good for the revenues or the economy, less likely to participate in a protest against extraction. So you can think about an alternative dependent variable, and some of this, you're going to see very similar results. The second point kind of speaks back to that ownership, right? It felt like these environmental concerns are fluid, right? That when people are presented with this hypothetical case that, or when we argue that maybe we can magnify the benefits of mining, right? It looks like those concerns go away, which is may not be good news, right? But I guess the silver lining here is, I guess part of what you can pick up from the survey is that you have individual level support, but the resistance is collective, right? So the survey it is what it is. So that those individual level attitudes, they're not a force because unlike the opposition. And finally, the last point that I mentioned is the importance of local conditions, right? I mean, all politics is local, right? And when you think about how the approval of the governor becomes a predictor of some of these of mining, right? So it's speaking directly about those local conditions. And I will be happy to take any questions you may have about the survey, Tia Maria, or just mining in general. Thank you.
Do you go back to the check that you had that said support for?
This one?
Yes. Because I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly, but after that red line, those are people that support, that's where the support for the mine is. So,
Yeah, so the way you would read this, sorry.
go ahead.
So anything that is above the red line it will be a positive, effect, and anything is below the line, you see the negative right here, it will be a negative response, right? But the variables that are significant are only the variables that don't cross the line, right? So if you look at the personal economy, it crosses the line, so it's not a significant predictor of support for theoria. So we're only focusing on these effects that are above the line. So this will be 1, this will be 2, this will be 3, and this will be 4. So the other variables are not significant predictors.
Okay.
And then I haven't presented this, but from this you can also calculate probabilities, right? So I think it's about 30 to 60%, something like that. So somebody who thinks, for example, somebody who thinks that the execution of the revenues from mining is good is 60% more likely to support mining.
So when I look at education, it doesn't mean that people that are educated are more likely.
No. So in this case, well, the right way to say that as far as this analysis, we're saying that there may be a relationship between education and mining, but it's not significant. So we don't know if more education leads to more mining or less education leads to more mining. It's just simply not. It's not a significant predictor of those cycles. So.
Thank you.
So this combines respondents who are in Islay and also in Arequipa?
Yes. So it includes both Arequipa and Islay.
Did you try separating out whether it's sort of,
Yes.
is there a big regional divide in terms of?
It's like running two subsamples, one for Islay. Yes, and I think Arequipa is helping. There's definitely a stronger opposition to mining in Islay compared to Arequipa.
And the mine is actually located in Islay, is that right? The project?
Say that again.
Where is the location of the project, the Tia Maria?
It's right here. So that's Arequipa, so the southern province right here. Right, so this is Moquegua, that's Tacna, and Chile right here. So these are the three districts that have been heavily involved in the mobilizations against Tia Maria, Coca Chacra, and it's because of this agricultural valley called Valle Tambo. So we interview people in all of these districts, right? So when I went to do the survey, for those of you who you may be better. So, but everything, Guayendo is a big city, right? But you're driving there and it's just like a regular, any other city. But as soon as you get to this region, pretty much every single house had a green flag that says no mining, yes agriculture, right? And it was just highly visible, right? And in the survey, we were a little bit concerned in the sense that, if you were to live here and you were to say, I support mining, maybe your neighbors will not like you very much, right? Because everybody had a flag in their house saying, we don't support, mining. And then I told it, when I did the survey, I told the students, if you guys bring me a flag, there's a gift waiting. And the students brought me 3 flags. I don't know, I guess they stole it from one of the houses. I don't know what they did. So I have the flags in my house. But, so part of, a lot of the people that even that are working in mine, they work here. Right? So in other words, those 2 places are interconnected, right? And people who work in other mines also live in the region, in Arequipa. That's the big city. That's the place where people are. So, but it's divided, right? So
I know you said that they were in there since the 1950s. Is it a Peruvian-owned mine, or is it Canadian or US?
It was mostly U.S. The government, my recollection is that the government has some ownership on that Peruvian, when it was Southern Peruvian Copper Corporation, but originally it's an American company. But I was talking about this earlier, some people have argued that it was the change in ownership that happened in 2005, 2006, when they purchased this major mining company in Mexico, that maybe changed the character of the...
So that was Mexico?
No, it's still Mexican. No. There was a change in ownership in 2005, 2006. But my point here is that for people who have lived in that area, Southern had a nice reputation, right? So historically it's been in the region. So workers were proud of working at Southern. So it didn't have a bad image, so to speak. I think this kind of speaks directly to, you're bringing a mining project close to an agricultural area, right? And that's where the clash is.
Yeah, I guess along the lines of the question about sort of like the location where you surveyed, I wonder if there's also a relationship between those who have land and those who don't. So although there might be, presumably people that work in agriculture that have land and that work their own land, or farm workers, although they're both involved in agriculture, they have a very different relationship to the land as the environment, I guess.
It took me a while. This was something that was not very clear when I first started working on this. But I think it's both. But their sense is more like, once mining comes in, their agricultural way of life is gone forever. Right? So if mining arrives and they contaminate the water, they contaminate the lakes, like in northern Peru, in Cajamarca, there's no longer agriculture. So the argument that would be is that, my father was a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer, right? We come from a generation of farmers, right? And so when they're defending agriculture, they're defending, way of life, right? And they know that they're not going to be on the top of the list to work at the mine, right? And that's a little bit of what the resistance is. But some of them are owners. In the cases that I've seen in Peru, I guess you can call it agricultural elites, right? That there will be 1, maybe 3, 4 families that are the major producers of something in that area. That they will be, part of the resistance because they are defending a way of life. For me, that was not. I heard about it in books, but. I guess going into the field, you can actually see it and you can relate to this, right? You can see why they have that, strong conviction against mining.
Yeah.
So from what you presented, I understood that it seems that if the mines, maybe in association with the state, were willing to sit with the people, negotiate, really understand their concerns, people, it seems, not all of them, but some of them, and it would have an impact on the collective, would be willing to negotiate their interest for the environment and for agriculture in exchange of a fair treatment, right? Now, we don't know the numbers of your case, but from the numbers of other mining projects in Colombia, usually what these companies pay to the country is almost nothing. Sometimes even they get more in subsidies than they pay in taxes. So they not only take the minerals, but they also take revenue from government in exchange of other things like good relationships among those in charge. So my point is, even if these companies double their efforts, their resources that they give back to the communities in place, even if they double that, that would not affect their earnings. The owners of these companies are multi-billionaires. People are struggling for less than a minimum.
Right.
Why do you think they don't do it? They could have a mine, they could have the support of the people, and it would not affect their earnings. But why do you think they don't? They are not willing to negotiate that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to be clear, I'm in agreement in the sense that mining companies have the upper hand, right? So they're going to come in with multi-billion-dollar investment plans, and a government like Peru is going to say yes. Why not? And they're going to kind of like we were talking about this earlier with Kevin, they're going to get the most out of the Peruvian government, right? So whether it's low taxes or subsidies, right? So they have the upper hand. That's why, if they are able to break up a community in opposition and support, in a way the mining company has already won, and that's exactly what they do, right? So right now we have an organized resistance, right? If somehow they're able to break that community in two, most likely the concession goes forward, right? So I guess the second part, at least in the Peruvian case, and this is something that has happened fairly recent, right? In the old days, the revenues that are coming from mining highly centralized. So they will go to the government in Lima and very little for the region of Arequipa. Right? In 2002, the government of Toledo basically made up this, created this decentralization program. Right? So now a region like Arequipa has a governor. It used to be called the president of the region, now they have a governor. Right? And now the region of Arequipa gets 50% of the profits that are coming from mining, or not
The tax
profits,
revenues.
it's income taxes.
Yeah.
Right? So they're getting a share, whereas in the past they got zero. Right? So those revenues, you can see the impact of those revenues in terms of, better roads and, the infrastructure of the city has changed. Just to give you a quick example, if you arrive in Arequipa, now the airport has, what do you call it? It's called mangas. What it is?
Okay. Yeah. The stretching arms
Yes.
from the alleys.
Yes. So, which is like, you never see that. In the old days, you just get on the plane and, and your hat is blowing because it's so windy. But, and then it was, and people, the locals jokingly, talk is because globalization has arrived in Arequipa, right? But a lot of it's tied to mining. A lot of that's, so I would say that you can see some of those benefits of those revenue transfers trickling in the region, right? And I have other questions. There were other questions about people's perception of what the impact of mining is on jobs, on the local economy. Right? So I did not include this in the analysis, but there's other ways to capture that effect. So I don't think it's zero. I think maybe the Colombia case may be more centralized, but definitely in Peru, it's actually here, Moquegua, right? There's not a lot of people in Moquegua. It's underpopulated, but they have a huge mining company. And if you calculate per capita, mineral transfers, Moquegua is the second richest region in Peru in terms of per capita transfers. First is Ancash, then is Moquegua. Right? I think it has to do with the revenues divided by the population.
Okay.
So I'm curious about the source of the resistance of the people, because in my understanding there is no previous mining in the region, right?
Near the region, not in this area.
But in general, I'm curious about the relationship between these protesters and like this sort of political elites in the local areas and like the general population, right? Of how this relationship works, like. So is it that the people, is it about the individual preferences of the people that then later impacts on more protest? Or is it that the other way around? Like, so you have like local branches of national organizations or national political parties that are working there, like in the political education of the people. So the relationship would be, first you have these local political elites, protesters, doing the work to promote this resistance to the mining. Like, what is the source of it?
Well,
Can I follow up to that
sure.
question? How does identity play into the source as well? Thinking of whether they're indígenas or they identify as campesinos versus in Cajamarca, for instance, how does those identities shape whether or not they agree with the party?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's a little bit of learning here, right? In the sense that there's hundreds of mining complexes in Peru, and you pick up a regular newspaper and you see something in northern Peru, this has happened. And in this particular case, right, people will make reference to Cajamarca, right? So Cajamarca, you have the largest gold mine in Latin America called Yanacocha, right? And they have a history of polluting the lakes, paying farmers a dime for their lands, and so all that knowledge in a way filters to the events here. So the local elites, those producers organizations, they know what has happened in Cajamarca, right? So this is not, they are aware, right? My understanding, well, first of all, it was mostly the local organizations, farmers, that play a role, going back to the mobilizations in 2011, the referendum. Right? In the second wave, we're talking about 2005, there will be other organizations from Cajamarca, from other places that will arrive in Tia Maria and say, we're here to help, right? But you did not see those organizations in the first wave, right? So because in the beginning it's mostly the local, local organizations in the area. Politicians is always tricky. We're talking about the municipal mayors or the regional, even the regional government. Right? They are more like opportunists. Right? If they see that there's a lot of opposition, they oppose the project. Right? If they see that there's support for the project, they support the project. So they're like, it's hard to predict what role they're going to play. They're a little bit of waiting to see how the project will evolve. But at least in Cocacha, in Tia Maria, right, the mayors of Mejia, Cocachacra, heavily involved in coordinating their efforts with that front, calling for regional strikes, organizing strikes, organizing demonstrations. And so, but that's not always the case.
So you had a predictor that is political interest or something?
Yes.
That wasn't significant, right? So what did you
So
try to
this is just
calculate?
like standard controls of how, how interest in politics you may be, right? People use it in trying to predict.
How do you capture this? Like,
It's just a question,
from 1 to 5, let's say?
No, it's just asking, ¿cuán interesado estás en la política? But again, the survey has 108 questions or something like that. You can put control for ideology, right, left, right. There was also a question about knowledge of Tia Maria, right? So in other words, there were specific questions about events, about Southern Corporation, about leaders of the movement, right? So if people said yes, 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 so obviously they had a lot of knowledge on Tia Maria. So you can put that as a control, just to make sure that people understand what is being asked. Right, so there's a variable that talks about people's participation in community organizations, and that's actually a negative predictor of support for Tia Maria. And so people who are engaged in, what were the examples of kind of like service organizations, right? And the way you capture that is,